Bom dia. Só voltando aqui para nossa sequência, teremos agora a palestra do arquiteto Jacques Herzog. Eu vou repetir a apresentação, enfim, desde que a sala encheu um pouco mais desde o início. Então, Jacques Herzog é sócio do escritório Herzog de Meuron e detentor do Pritzker Prize de 2001 e do Riba Royal Gold Medal de 2007, vencidos em parceria com Pierre de Meuron, aqui presente hoje também, e os sócios sêniores Christine Binswanger, Asken Mergenthaler e Stefan Marbach. Juntos são autores de projetos de grande destaque no mundo, como a Tate Modern, o Laban Center em Londres, a Allianz Arena de Munique e o Ninho de Pássaro em Pequim. Também são responsáveis por projetar o Complexo Luz, que será construído no centro da capital paulista. Com vocês, um dos maiores nomes da arquitetura mundial contemporânea, Mr. Jacques Herzog.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank for the invitation and the occasion to talk here in front of you. A lecture is like a project because every time we have been asked to do a presentation, we have done so many things in the last 30 years that 33 years actually, that it's very difficult to show everything. So we have to make a selection and to develop an idea of what we should present and what the topic or what the issue should be, and also to motivate ourselves again and again to look at the work from a different side, and ideally also to trigger questions. So the Q&A that follows the presentation is especially always interesting for us for feedback. Of the many things we have done, you see that there are some so-called highlights that many people know, many newspapers have been publishing. Maybe we could start with the first one. Could you bring the full picture? Yeah. This is the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which is a very, very important new project for us, which is on the way, which is subject to very difficult financial and time issues, which is a lecture in itself. But I don't want to further present this because I would like to rather focus on very small things. Those are just a few images of that very important project that maybe in the future I could present. I also don't want to speak about another very important project which is somehow at the basis of our international trajectory, the Tate in London, Tate Modern, where you can see the turbine hall that has become a very successful public space. This is perhaps the key element for the success of the project. The success in the sense that the building is very, very well accepted by the population of London. And the addition, the extension to the Tate Modern, which is now under construction. Or thirdly, the Bird's Nest in Beijing that has equally, like the Turbine Hall, become a very popular and successful public space, being a kind of a three-dimensional sculpture, a kind of a public sculpture. And the day of the opening and the interior of the stadium now being a kind of a park. I certainly will briefly talk about the project, why we are here in Sao Paulo, which is a cultural center for dance and music, and what we do and why we do what we do, and related to the building we recently finished in Miami, which uses similar architectural language and a similar way to open up an otherwise enclosed and privatized building. Probably the time is not enough to also present this in the Vitra house in near Basel, but we will see. I will rather talk about, and the main part of the presentation will rather be devoted to a very intimate topic, which is I will present 3 pavilions and will show in which way a pavilion, which seems to be a totally unimportant architectural topic, can be incubator for architectural innovation, and to find ways and test things that then can become very fruitful in other projects. For this, we go back to the very beginning of our career, the early years, when, and this is certainly interesting for the students here, that whatever we've done in the early years was based on competitions. We entered the competition for this seemingly such a stupid thing, like a small pavilion in the garden of a hotel. And the hotel being called Eden, which means paradise, we used that particular word, and words and letters were the ingredients of this pavilion, together with the park that was so wonderful and is so wonderful that we said everything should have to do with this piece of nature, much more than with a particular form. Those 3 pavilions that I would present are very interesting maybe in that they are proposing concepts how to encounter, how to find and develop vocabularies or forms and other things. That's how the pavilion was conceived, out of these 4 letters that were used as columns. And also I think is interesting conceptually that we presented this model for the competition entry together with a projection, a slide projection onto the wall of the park, so the park would be projected on the pavilion, and the light of the projector would then project the word Eden in a correct way, whereas the perspective to the pavilion itself would not allow for identify the word Eden. By the way, do you have a laser pointer? Could you also turn off that light on my head? It's so strong, I can't see anything. And this one also. Yeah, that's much better. That's how we sort of developed this concept of those 4 columns and finding different angles from where you could read the word and others where you couldn't read the word. So it would be not so obvious, it would not be like in pop art an obvious strategy, but it would be rather a hidden surprise. Other ingredients would be that ceiling that is remindful of the crown of the trees, and of course how to make it, how to produce it, those very thin columns. So what started obviously at that time to be interesting for us is how we could use words, the most abstract thing, that the most alien, the most away from what normally we would consider architecture, to use as an architectural ingredient. We tried when we were young, until now, to grasp whatever we could and question it as a potential architectural matter, as a potential architectural substance. In the next very conceptual project, we have been asked to develop a fantasy, a vision for Berlin after the fall of the wall in the late 80s, 1990, to do a proposal how the east and the west of the city could come together. And we were proposing mountain-like buildings that had actually no form, but that would be defined by words that would appear and disappear. We later took it further in a competition in France for a cultural center. We did a volume which was almost like those gas tanks that were built in the 19th century, bands or ribbons of letters running around the building, and with the changing and moving letters would blur the identity between the volume and the rest of the site. So somehow this was very interesting for us, very intriguing for us, and we found it also very appealing to develop this further together with artists. At that time we worked a lot with conceptual artist Remy Zaug, who instead of painting landscape used descriptions, poetic descriptions for what he saw basically in the world. In one building, the Library for Cottbus, we used texts or letters in overlaying them in a way that they would produce the matter, the substance for the facade. In an otherwise clearly defined, in a one-hand side, clearly defined volume, in a second reading, you would not be able to decipher really what the real form of the building was. So the letters were silkscreen printed onto the surface of glass, and from close you could guess what the letters were, but through overlaying they became almost like a pattern which helped blur the form. We wanted to escape the clarity of form as opposed to what very often modernism has done. Inside, this form was somewhat contradicted in that we introduced a linear structure which was opening up rooms of total variety of 1 story, 2 story, 3 stories. That also the transparency or the translucency of the facade would allow that space, that spatial organization inside to become visible to the outside towards the end of the day. So that's like one line of developing a possible use of letter. Another one was this pavilion in Jinhua in China that was a total new step in our way of working, in that we tried to use the computer to produce forms before we developed some forms ourselves. The idea was that we developed a pattern, we gave a pattern that was based on different angles, different heights, different measurements that came from the human body, from sitting, from leaning, from standing. So all these things went into this pattern as a potential, as an option. And through applying that pattern on the top of a cube, we would produce that pattern, or we would project that pattern in the 3rd dimension, like we could see here. And through this projection, we would generate virtually an endless possibility of different intersections, that all these lines would shoot the 3 directions and would create a grid of endless possibilities. Once these endless possibilities would be visible on the screen and offer us different options of intersections, different forms, like for instance this one, we could say stop. We somehow like this one. We also somehow like this one. So it's like in nature, we often compare this to clouds that you see on the sky. These pass by without your own creation. But your creativity or your, let's say, your contribution is that, for instance, a photographer takes a picture of this constellation of clouds rather than another one. So through picking, through selecting options, you create form. And this is what we try to do here. We otherwise never developed form on the computer. We only used computer as a tool to produce ideas that we had developed traditionally. But this was, for the first time, a different way to use the computer as a serious tool, like an extension of our own mind. Strangely, afterwards, once we found a constellation that seemed very appropriate, that it could sit and stand and offer a certain magic in that garden, we scanned it so that it could be used, the scan could be used like traditional plans, like architectural plans. So the computer helped us to develop the form, but not to make the building, to produce the building, something that could be done with new technology. But being in China and doing this roughly 10 years ago, technology was not so advanced, so we had to scan down all these different sections, like sections of a brain, and produce it manually in a very old-fashioned, almost medieval way. As you can see here, and what we liked about this kind of juxtaposition or this contrast between the form finding and creating, surprising, such a form you could not invent. So we tried to use a tool that, so to speak, would do it for us. And then the production of it was so traditional and based on craftsmanship that we liked the outcome being very almost brutal and very sensual. So I think very often something that is the product of such an unlikely mix produces interesting results. Now, out of this process of using computer and random arrangements or seemingly random arrangements, this is something we continued to develop further. Like, for instance, in this building of Actelion, which is a pharmaceutical company, biotech company in Basel, we followed a not dissimilar pattern in that we decomposed the traditional building, courtyard building, in different floors and different elements and arranged them widely in different ways till we found something, a certain logic that was turning around four cores, and that helped us optimize the way people would move through that building. We wanted a building that was an office building, but was a special office building in that it would rethink how people could come together in unexpected ways and to create, like in nature again, places where you would be more encouraged or easily come together, like under a tree or near a river, in places that would not be all the same. It would not be so clearly structured like a normal office building is, that you have meeting rooms, that you have office rooms, that you have the stair, but that all these things would be arranged in a way that it creates surprise, and that people could come together in places they wouldn't even have expected, that they meet and the building offers niches and other places that encourage them and make them feel like they are not seen so easily by anybody else, or is not such a formally organized way of being inspired or having good ideas. And that's the result. The result is, of course, formally very striking, very new, and the people love it. The people like to use it. It could have been a disaster. It could have been a total confusion and made people mad. But we tested it in models before we then constructed it. You can also see in this building that it's not dissimilar to Vitra, which is also based on these arms that are laying on top of each other. But in contrast to Vitra, here the sides are all open, they are glazed, so that you have views in all directions. So on one hand side, you are being protected like in a cave structure. On the other hand, you have much more view options and much more ways to get sun or shadow, to have contact with vegetation, with the garden, etc. I would like to present our conceptual thinking about for the Sao Paulo project. In some way, the Sao Paulo project being a kind of an attempt of not producing a form is somehow could be seen in the family of, like the Actelian pavilion, in that we have a concept of form which is based on laying, overlaying, putting things on top, stacking in some way, and not offering one form that would be finite and that would be here forever and couldn't be changed. And we will see why and what's the advantage of such a procedure. You know Sao Paulo much better than we do. We had to look very carefully in the city, and were both shocked and surprised in that so much is based on objects. So many objects are around, very powerful ones, in a very dense, condensed way, almost an ocean of high-rise and form. At the same time, we also found other buildings, especially very strong ideas of the 60s of modernism, where nature plays a more important role. And form is very powerful, like here, but nature can take over, like in this famous restaurant that we love so much for this particular quality, that nature seems to dominate everything else rather than form. And that we wanted the building to be in some way relating to the park and to the green, and to offer green in an area which is now not having a lot of green, and especially not having a lot of buildings that would attract people, and the people of totally different social layers. So in the foreground, more than doing another building where you go in and go out, where you have a clear preference for one thing, you would do a building that doesn't offer you at first sight one only entrance, one only program, the dance school or the theater or the music hall or whatever, but it is a compound of different options and different places where you could go. So this diversity and this complexity and also the combination of that, not segregate one program versus the other, is in the foreground of our concept. You know that we have 3 theaters, we have dance school, we have music school, we have public space, and we have that all together. And we decided to take color for all these different layers, not only because we think, in the first line we took colors because we wanted to be sure that we arranged those different program parts in a way that they would not be segregated, but they would overlap and intersect. So the colors somehow were a test for us. That we could see that those differently colored bands would be on top and next to each other and not be one is here, one is there, one is at the very end. At the same time, using these colors again and again, we also thought that those could not be just a conceptual trick, but in fact could become a real architectural tool. So we would probably use intense color all through the building. We've used color in previous architectures, like this building here, which is in London, which is also a dance school, the Laban Dance Center. But of course, this is London, so everything is introverted. As much as the Sao Paulo project is a naked project, is a project where the bones are exposed and the muscles, much more than the form as a whole thing. It is the opposite here, where also the form is not so obvious because it's blurred with these different colors, but it's a clear volume. And the program is introverted. But here too, we said we wanted, instead of just doing classrooms, give the public space and the internal public space a kind of an urban quality, like a street or like a avenida or a place to come together. So this moment of public and communal space is in the foreground of all these important public projects, where besides the functioning, the architect adds something that was not, let's say, in the brief, that was not in the program, that was not something that he was told by the client. So I think that's certainly one of the most important steps we have made in our work compared to the very early ones, that we learned to fight for this kind of possibility, to arrange program in a way that it would offer something that didn't exist without this particular project. So that's the use of color, and it's a particular use of color. There is a psychology of color, and maybe once the building is done here in Sao Paulo, we can talk about what makes that use of color different from this cloudy use here in London, where the color would almost blur with the sky, something that in Sao Paulo is impossible, where the contrasts are much starker and is producing a totally different sense of color than here. And I think that's also a theme. We may take it further sometime, that architecture helps making cities more specific, more different. And strangely, even if you use the same ingredients, color here, color there, has to do a totally different thing. It has to fulfill a totally different function. But it animates the building. It animates it in London, and it animates it here in Sao Paulo. So those are the colors, again, that we have selected so far. And that's certainly the most interesting model so far we've done, which is not only the boards have been tinted, but also the people. We produced yellow ones, pink ones, etc., and arranged them in a way that they would walk through the model in where they had to go. So we were sure that not only yellow guys would be with yellow guys, but pink ones would be with yellow ones, with blue ones, with green ones. So that's a working method, a conceptual method that we insist to continue to work with till the architectural concept or the architectural project almost results from that as a logical consequence. Of course, concrete will play an important role as a material and color, but that is not yet so far that developed that I could present it as a final solution. But what I can present as a final solution is this project here in Miami, which is in some way the small brother of the Sao Paulo project, in that it uses similar elements and ingredients, and in that, especially nature and plants are playing an important role. What makes it interesting is that it's being put in a place here where the client wanted to do a garage, a parking garage with some stores, and that would have been the normal outcome of the project. He also bought this old bank building, and our first reaction was that the building should be as tall as this one, but zoning wouldn't allow for it, so we had to go to court and convince the judges and the committee that we would allow to do this building without adding floor area. So in other words, the client would just spend more money to get the same amount of usable floor space. But we wanted to take the floors apart, the floor slabs, so that the space could breathe more and the building would be more airy, and putting a car would not just be a boring thing, but would be an interesting experience. And in this we were inspired by that picture, which is, I think, in Detroit, where in an opposite kind of process, a garage was not made nicer, but a nice building, a former theater, was used or downgraded to a garage. And those things, those kind of moments of transformations are very interesting drivers of urban energy, and that's what we wanted to do in Miami. So we said the fact of driving in and parking the car should not be an act of secondary importance, but could make the project or could animate the whole project. So we made the whole garage public, open, and an interesting experience for the cars, but also for the people. So the people would go up and have a view in the city, and that kind of experience would need to follow a specific pattern, like a dancing rhythm, where the cantilevers of the different platforms would be inspired by the movement of the cars. As you can see here, that according to where you put the car and where the car would then go up, and the cutouts in the platform would lead to these different cantilevers and these differently shaped columns. The other idea of the client, I must say, was that not only it should have retail on the ground floor and cars above, but that the program would be distributed all over the building. So we would have a bar here, we would have residents on top, and we would ideally have a shop even somewhere in between. So that was a totally new typology in Miami, and a building that would not downgrade one activity versus the other. I think that's something we always also insist a lot, that in a building we don't distinguish between things that are important and should be seen and others that should be secluded or excluded. Very often technical functions are excluded or are sidelined. On an urban scale, very often energy plans or sewage plants have that role of almost criminalized architectures. And we wanted to use this project to put, to give a garage as a project, to take that serious and to make it a building like as important as any other building. Also, its relationship to nature and to the public area in the front was very important, and we could co-design this. So at night and during the day, it would be a very attractive, airy place, and add something that Miami hasn't had in the past. Miami being known for pleasure, for sun, for light, for plants. But in fact, till today, most of the buildings are in decorated boxes, Art Deco style boxes, and this building is, I think, the first one of a new generation of possible buildings that would open up themselves to the ideal climatic conditions that you have in Miami, as much as you have them here, and as much as you could take advantage of those ideal conditions. In that also it offers different scales within the whole thing, compressed or open, with courtyards and stairs, ramps. The garage is being used for yoga classes that are organized, parties. Everything is mixed together. Everything works and lives together. This is how we imagine also the Sao Paulo project, that people come together that otherwise wouldn't come together, and that architecture allows for it or animates that kind of mixture. That the garden comes down, the garden on the top, the stair to the top residence. We also designed some of his furniture and the garden, which we wouldn't believe this is in a garage. So architecture should create also that kind of surprise and unexpected moments. This is the last slide. Thank you for your attention.
Bom, pessoal, nós vamos agora chamar os demais participantes aí que vão estar fazendo uma conversa e também respondendo a perguntas e respostas. Então, quem quiser endereçar a sua pergunta, é só entregar, que serão encaminhadas aqui e direcionadas aos palestrantes, tá? Então, eu queria chamar de volta o Lelé, aqui ao palco, por favor. Chamar também a Karen Stein. A Karen Stein é consultora de design, professora da School of Visual Arts de Nova York e diretora do George Nelson Foundation. Karen foi editora da Phaidon Press e da revista Architectural Record. Autora de várias obras sobre arquitetura e design, é colaboradora de publicações como a New York Magazine e do World of Interiors. É membro do Architectural League e da New York e faz parte do júri do Prêmio Pritzker. Queria também chamar Fernando Serapião, arquiteto, jornalista, editor da revista Monolito e é o curador desta edição do Arq.Futuro.
I want to to start off by saying thank you to both of you for really great presentations, and it's both a pleasure and an honor to be with you here. We're going to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes having hopefully a bit of a discussion among these two architects, and including questions. Fernando has collected a series of questions from many of you in the audience, so we want to sprinkle those questions in. But I wanted to start off my first question with a bit of an observation. I was struck that you showed obviously your own very different work, but there were some themes that were similar. So much of what we see in the magazines today and what's talked about are buildings as objects. I would sort of characterize them as buildings as nouns. But what you both showed in your own way are buildings as verbs, buildings that breathe, that engage, that affect, that shape. And I thought that that came through very powerfully in both of your presentations. I wonder whether you each think that's a fair assessment, and also what you were struck by in each other's presentations. Perhaps you could begin, Lele.
Bom, essas experiências todas que eu tive com diferentes programas, né, que foram apresentados aqui, né, foram oportunidades diferentes, porque, de fato, a minha atuação sempre foi ligada ao poder público. Então, a minha atuação é um reflexo da demanda que houve do poder público. As fábricas, todas essas atividades, não foram procuradas por mim. Quer dizer, na verdade, foram oportunidades que se criaram devido ao meu trabalho ligado ao poder público. Quer dizer, eu fui, no princípio da minha atuação, fui professor da universidade, né? De forma que da Universidade de Brasília, na criação da Universidade de Brasília, como eu disse lá, nós queríamos que a escola fosse ligada a uma produção, inclusive para cidades, né, que fosse também um instrumento de construção da cidade e de produção dos edifícios. E daí, por diante, eu segui sempre ligado ao poder público. Então, eu creio que o meu trabalho ele reflete assim justamente esse aspecto de um trabalho mais ligado à produção social de uma população, quer dizer, mais pobre, né, que existe ainda no meu país, né, e uma população também que demanda prédios muito simples, coisas bastante econômicas, né? De forma que eu acho que esse aspecto assim, muito diverso que a minha produção apresenta, com pontes, coisas às vezes até projetos maiores, né? Ela reflete unicamente uma demanda, e as oportunidades se criaram, dado que eu nunca fui um promotor de obras através de uma empresa própria, né? Eu sempre fui o reflexo das demandas que existiam nos programas sociais que foram abordados.
Do you see any similar themes in your work with the work that Herzog and Demeron do? Do you see any? Do you feel that there are similar interests that you share as architects, you and Jacques?
I do understand. Melhor falar me dá aqui.
My question was, do you think that there are similar interests that you share with the work of Herzog and Demeron?
Claro. Claro, eu acho que a forma de abordar do Jacques, que eu sempre admirei muito, né, que evidentemente que é uma forma muito mais sutil de tratar a arquitetura, porque, inclusive, a sociedade, o projeto assim, que ele teve a ocasião de fazer, né, é uma sociedade muito mais organizada do que a nossa, né? E eu acho que eu vejo muita similaridade, por exemplo, nessa proposta que ele faz de se inspirar muito na questão da natureza, de organizar os espaços de uma forma racionalizada, usando a computação. Eu acho que tudo isso é uma coisa bastante lógica. Agora, evidentemente que essa similaridade existe, mas é preciso que o produto final, né, que ele permita, evidentemente que num programa como eu abordei de escolas para a pobreza do Rio de Janeiro, para a pobreza a premência social é tão grande, né, que a especulação tem que ser uma especulação mais direta em torno das emergências que se criam. Eu, por exemplo, considero todas as intervenções que foram feitas nessas cidades, nas zonas mais pobres, de intervenções provisórias, que eu chamo de intervenções transitórias, né? Que seria, vamos dizer, a conquista de uma melhoria, principalmente na área de educação, na área de saúde, para depois chegar a um patamar mais evoluído, né? Que realmente outras especulações pudessem ser feitas. Mas numa situação emergencial que essas populações vivem, eu creio que seria impossível a gente especular com uma condição, vamos dizer, econômica diferente, né, os programas que são apresentados.
Bom, é um prazer estar aqui também. Gostaria de agradecer aos dois a oportunidade que vocês estão nos dando, uma plateia cheia de estudantes. E por isso eu gostaria de endereçá-los uma pergunta relacionada justamente à formação de ambos. Obviamente que a obra de Lelé não tem uma raiz inicial no Niemeyer, mas talvez o discípulo mais interessante, porque juntou outras coisas, não é? E do Jacques Herzog tem no início da carreira algum contato com Aldo Rossi. Eu gostaria que vocês respondessem para os estudantes o que vocês aprenderam com esses dois autores, quer dizer, o que você, Lelé, aprendeu com Niemeyer e o que você, Jacques, aprendeu com o Aldo Rossi, quer dizer, o que você consegue identificar no seu trabalho, bom, isso eu aprendi com ele.
What I think is a privilege for every young person to have a great teacher, and certainly Aldo Rossi was a great teacher. We admired him and loved him, and now that I'm older and looking back, I must say that I can also criticize him, and perhaps he was not the greatest of all the architects, but he's certainly one of the great guys of that period, and for this we admire him. I think that as a student, you always reject the professor later, and you have to do this. So this is, you cannot avoid this, but that's okay. We will be rejected also, but it's good to have someone strong with a very strong mind. And I think there are two patterns. One is that the teacher is almost like an ideologist and a religious master that you reject for this, but at least was a strong example. Or then is the conceptual style, which is perhaps more our style, that you encourage people to go deep into the things, that is very much based on curiosity and concepts that I try to describe today as a method. By the way, I enjoyed very much Lele's presentation, and we speak also in Pierre's mind. We really admire him. We don't say this just to be polite. Also, I think we shouldn't talk on stage too much about other architects' work, but what I see in his work is really modernism at its best, that he defends the integrity and integrality of architecture versus the fragmented position, which is exactly also what we stand for. What I admired here is the curiosity to develop things that now sometimes seem impossible in a world where liability issues, legal issues, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, there is a fire code, there is all these things are cutting and chopping apart the otherwise wide field of architecture. And I think to teach this, to come back to your question, to teach this to the young people, that they have, of course, to accept all these rules and codes, but to find a way to remain generalists, to remain themselves as the master of all these different things, is a big challenge. And I think teachers, professors should do this now. Earlier, that was not an issue. In our time, and also not in Lele's time, that was probably not an issue, because the world was so much more archaic.
E você, Lelé? que você aprendeu com Niemeyer?
A influência... eu comecei a trabalhar com o Oscar logo recém-formado. Evidentemente que uma pessoa com a importância que ele teve para a nossa arquitetura, isso foi fundamental na minha formação. Além do mais, quer dizer, pelo fato dele ser uma pessoa mais velha e um ser humano fantástico, também houve uma grande influência sobre o seu aspecto até humano, né? De forma que a minha relação, quer dizer, o que a gente pode ver quando há uma certa liberdade na produção, né? E os espaços são tratados com um pouco mais de liberdade, a minha produção quase sempre, eu como disse, foi voltada para os aspectos mais para programas mais pobres, né, da sociedade, mas sempre que há uma certa liberdade na concepção do espaço, a gente sente a influência de Oscar. Pode até, em alguns hospitais da Rede Sara, a gente pode sentir, principalmente no tratamento espacial, a gente tem que sentir a influência de Oscar, né? Na minha arquitetura, evidentemente que a arquitetura de Oscar sempre foi voltada para programas excepcionais. E no trabalho que eu apresento, eu não tenho praticamente nenhum prédio que tenha as mesmas características da produção de Oscar. Talvez essa última igreja que a gente nota uma influência muito grande na produção de Oscar.
One of the questions that I have that might be of interest to the students is, last night I was speaking a bit with Jacques and Pierre about their office. We heard yesterday that they have something like 350 people in the office from 30 nations. And we spoke briefly about the fact that actually one of their greatest projects, creative projects, is the office itself. Building that team, keeping that team. The office is a living organism of its own. So it might be interesting for students to hear a bit about what that's like to build an office from both of you, and what it is that you really need to be able to sustain a practice over a long period of time. Jacques, maybe you could start.
Yeah, you said basically everything, Karen. We have, of course, a very large office, perhaps the largest in the world, which does that kind of experimental, crazy things, because you can do experimental work in a small team more easily than in a big company. But this is the way, and we've been very fortunate that we live, as Lele said, in a more organized society, which allows us to be more efficient and to do more things. On the other hand, very often there is a danger that we are too efficient and too, well organized. We hate corporate architecture and corporate companies, so we put a lot of energy and creativity in shaping and organizing how we work. We are not in one big building, but several buildings. We have people from many different countries, and we are very close to the projects and not to any blah blah and do unnecessary things.
Lele, maybe you could comment a bit about building a practice over a long period of time and the role of collaborators in that practice.
De colaboração em equipe, eu acho que eu penso que a questão do trabalho em equipe é fundamental de agora em diante, né, no processo de produção arquitetônica, né? Eu acho que, conforme eu abordei na minha palestra, né, eu acho que nós carecemos muito de uma linguagem que realmente atinja todas as pessoas que têm que participar de um projeto da produção arquitetônica. Eu acho que a fragmentação do conhecimento está produzindo cada vez mais uma produção solitária dos profissionais de arquitetura, quer dizer, sem haver essa integração de equipe, eu acho que a arquitetura fatalmente vai passar por um processo de dissolução. Antigamente, quer dizer, os arquitetos dominavam todos os aspectos da construção, né? Desde aqueles de ordem subjetiva, os programas, o aspecto construtivo, mas hoje, com o desenvolvimento tecnológico, nós temos realmente que nos apoiar em especialistas, né? Mas é preciso que falemos a mesma língua, de forma que o que eu tenho feito na minha vida profissional, isso até em consequência do próprio trabalho em fábricas, em comunidades de medicina, por exemplo, é justamente essa integração, quer dizer, esse processo que eu mostrei da Rede Sara foi profundamente discutido com enfermeiras, com médicos, com todas as pessoas que atuam no processo de tratamento do paciente. E foram revistos desde a concepção do próprio tratamento, foram revistos em função dos equipamentos e dos espaços para os equipamentos. As terapias que nós apresentamos em nossos projetos são quase sempre novas, resultado justamente dessa interação muito estreita de equipes multidisciplinares. De forma que eu acho que o processo de criação do arquiteto, daqui para frente, tem que se apoiar, sobretudo, nessa interação com equipes disciplinares. Evidentemente que existem os aspectos subjetivos que pertencem exclusivamente à criação do arquiteto. Mas existem os aspectos funcionais, por exemplo, no caso de um hospital, que tem que ser atendidos rigorosamente, né? Então, eu acho que essa interação, especialmente em programas mais complexos, é fundamental para o processo de produção.
Karen, eu vou fazer uma pergunta agora para o Jacques. Eu acho que aproveitando um gancho um pouco do que o Lelé falou, dessa colaboração dele com os médicos, fazendo esses hospitais da Rede Sara, eu gostaria que o Jacques comentasse um pouco a sua relação com os artistas plásticos, né? Então, acho que fica uma coisa curiosa, porque o Jacques, desde o início da carreira, dizem que o primeiro projeto que o escritório de vocês desenvolveu não foi um projeto, foi um carnaval, curiosamente, um suíço, junto com um artista plástico. E eu gostaria que você talvez focasse, para exemplificar esse trabalho seu junto com os artistas plásticos, com o Ai Weiwei, o chinês, talvez no Ninho do Pássaro ou no projeto do parque, o que você desejar.
Well, again, this is the fact that we have, since the beginning, worked with artists is very logical, and because they were of our friends and were part of our life, and because Basel is a city which is very much oriented towards art, so that was part of our way we grew up. So we were closer to this than to, let's say, architecture at the beginning, so that was natural. And at the same time, I believe that art is very important for architecture and for life, so things belong together. This again is what we just said. Lele and we ourselves defend the position of the architect as a generalist, as a person who is interested in different fields. And we, in our generation, which is maybe again a step like between Niemeyer and Lele and our generation, we did not grow up with modernism, so we had to really find our own way in a world that was collapsing, in a world of values that was collapsing. And artists do that all the time. You know, artists have no value system except for their own. They are in front of a blank canvas, and that's the worst horror scenario. Architects always complain that they are too much squeezed with programs and money and functions, but gladly they are, because they wouldn't know what to do otherwise.
I think when you're a student and you look at architects who have had great success in their careers, it's hard to imagine all of the steps that it took to get there. And I'm wondering if you, Lele, could talk about the difference between when you first started your practice, what the day in the office was like, versus now, after having a practice of all these years, how you spend your time differently now as an architect versus the first year that you had your practice?
O primeiro ano que eu comecei meu trabalho foi justamente em Brasília, né? Eu fui convocado, até nem como arquiteto, fui convocado para a construção da cidade. Por acaso, eu trabalhei em obras como engenheiro durante algum tempo, né? Sempre em obras projetadas por Oscar Niemeyer, mas os meus primeiros passos como arquiteto profissional, né, foram ligados já à produção de Oscar Niemeyer. Foi uma influência muito grande. E a influência dele se mantém até hoje, que até hoje eu mantenho uma amizade muito estreita com ele. Mas, na verdade, esse percurso todo que eu sinto hoje é sempre tentando aprender. Quer dizer, eu acho que a arquitetura é vista como um processo, né, que desde o processo criativo, que foi tão bem colocado aí pelo Jacques, né, acho que foi incrível a forma conceitual como ele desenvolve os projetos, né, fantástico, como eu disse para ele. Mas, é claro, mas evidentemente que nesse meu processo quando eu olho para trás, né, eu vejo que a minha vida foi muito condicionada, a minha profissão, meu desenvolvimento profissional foi muito condicionado a uma condição de trabalho, E olho para trás, não me arrependo, mas talvez pudesse ter tido outras oportunidades, pudesse ter chegado a um trabalho diferente. São questões do destino.
Aqui a gente tem uma questão que é para os dois, já da plateia. Tem muitos jovens aqui e, infelizmente, não está identificado quem fez essa pergunta, mas eles estão pedindo aqui dicas, não? Então, como começar a carreira? Como é que um jovem arquiteto inicia a sua carreira? Entra em grandes equipes para fazer concurso, inicia em pequeno escritório, junto com os colegas e vai crescendo aos poucos. Qual a sugestão que vocês têm para um estudante ou um recém-formado?
Bom, eu acho que na minha palestra até enderecei bastante para os estudantes, né? Eu acho que o ensino de arquitetura é um ensino que está bastante deficiente, até pelo desenvolvimento da nossa cultura, desenvolvimento cultural. Quer dizer, nós sentimos que o espaço de tempo que existe na escola para a formação do arquiteto é muito pequeno, de forma que essas práticas, a ligação, a cultura geral do arquiteto, ela fica muito prejudicada. Quer dizer, até hoje nós temos que nos informar, temos que aprender, né? E o arquiteto vai ficar toda a vida aprendendo. Evidentemente que a nossa profissão é difícil. Agora, é fundamental que na escola, né, a gente esteja ligado a todo o ferramental que o arquiteto precisa para executar um trabalho. Então, a primeira coisa que eu acho que a primeira dica, vamos dizer assim, que eu acho que não existem dicas, mas vamos dizer, a primeira postura seria essa, de ter uma certa humildade e tentar aprender o mais possível, né? E ir conquistando gradualmente uma compreensão que a nossa profissão exige, como generalista, nunca como especialista. Nós somos generalistas, é preciso que o arquiteto tenha isso bem claro, que ele vai ter que desenvolver a sua profissão dentro de um contexto geral de informação. Ele vai ter que ser sociólogo, ele vai ter que ser artista, né? Vai ter que interagir com técnicos especializados em várias áreas, e isso é fundamental para que o seu produto seja realmente tenha o seu controle, o seu domínio.
Mas vai para um grande escritório ou fica com os amigos?
Eu acho que o ideal que seria a escola fosse a monitora, né? Mas, para isso, nós temos que rever completamente o processo de formação, principalmente aqui no Brasil. Eu sei que em outras escolas, no exterior, o processo é bastante diferente. Outra coisa também que ocorre nos países mais civilizados, que a gente sabe, é que o projeto é muito mais valorizado. O arquiteto é responsável por todo um processo de construção, né? E aqui, infelizmente, o projeto é tratado como um desenho, né? Essa concepção também de desenho tem que ser eliminada. Eu falei até na minha exposição de arquitetos especializados em envelopar o prédio. Quer dizer, isso é uma coisa que não existe, né? Eu acho que o arquiteto ele tem que participar de todo o seu processo desde o princípio. A arquitetura é um processo, não é um desenho inicial, né? Conforme o Jacques colocou, né? Quantas coisas ele tem que rever nesse projeto de São Paulo, por exemplo, porque ele considera ainda que não é um projeto acabado, que ele ainda tem que rever certas etapas. E esse processo, como um todo, é que tem que ser examinado com uma interação muito grande com especialistas, com outros profissionais, já que o arquiteto não tem a capacidade de dominar tudo que é necessário.
E você, Jacques, qual a sugestão que você dá para um estudante ou recém-formado?
I agree with what Lele said. Everybody should be working wherever he or she can. I don't think that this is so important. If the country offers work, it's good to do different kind of work. I think it's not so easy to escape the trap of specialism, because the big company want you to work on the computer or in the model shop. Just they see very quickly where you are good, and then you are supposed to do this particular work. So that's not so easy. But I agree that it's a learning process, and you have to be, well, humble, you just have to do it. What I would suggest to a government, when I think back of the 70s in Basel, when we started very early our own practice, the city architect made something very good, which is he organized competitions and opened them especially for young people, but not huge competitions where everybody could participate, but he would say, this is the architecture scene, we have I don't know how many young architects, and he makes small competition where just 5 would be invited, and in the next competition another 5, so that all would have a chance to win a small building somewhere, and then to let them do what Lele also suggests, which is the whole thing, you know, to design it, but also to follow the construction site. That would be very, very helpful. And the fruit of that would be visible in 10 or 15 years when architects can practice very young their own responsibility. But that's a political revolution, initiative that I think Brazil could undertake.
As we are soon running out of time, perhaps we can take one more of the students' questions.
Tem uma pergunta endereçada ao Lelé. Por que não deu certo o seu projeto do Minha Casa Minha Vida, mostrado agora, se foi encomendado pela própria Dilma? A pergunta foi feita pela Maria Helena.
Eu estava escutando em inglês. Bom, o problema principal... O problema principal, porque não deu certo a nossa experiência com o programa Minha Casa e Minha Vida, foi justamente a burocracia que se estabeleceu no nosso país, né? Esse projeto Minha Casa Minha Vida é orientado pela Caixa Econômica, e a Caixa Econômica não descobriu uma forma, né, tecnocrática, né, de contratar o nosso instituto para desenvolver esse projeto novo. E o que foi pior é que nós, então, por uma questão de respeito até a uma solicitação da Presidência da República, nós desenvolvemos por nossa conta esse projeto. E não havia como eles, inclusive, nos pagarem pelo investimento que nós tínhamos feito, que foi grande. Então, isso resultou num processo de dissolução. Quer dizer, hoje o Instituto ele tem uma dívida que não pode, com ela ele não pode seguir mais. E nós desistimos. O processo de dissolução do Instituto foi justamente pela dificuldade de contratação. Quer dizer, o TCU, por exemplo, ele acha que para contratar um escritório dentro do programa Minha Casa Minha Vida tem que ser através de um sistema de concorrências, né, que prevaleça só o preço. Não existe nem projetos definidos, mas, enfim, que prevaleça o preço. E isso é feito através de uma planilha, né, em que os preços são todos especificados, e o que nós estávamos propondo era uma planilha completamente diferente, né? Por sinal, muito mais barata do que se pratica hoje. Mas isso não pôde ser executado. Então, o resultado é que nós, nesse processo, fomos nos extinguir e acabamos desistindo. Ainda hoje, de vez em quando, alguém nos pergunta que se pode ser assim, mas se decorrido de um ano, não houve nenhuma possibilidade de contratação do nosso Instituto. Por incrível que pareça, o nosso Instituto é uma entidade sem fins lucrativos, reconhecida pelo Ministério da Justiça, como tem que ser, né? e destinada a programas dedicados à sociedade, a obras sociais, né, e ao ensino de arquitetura. Então, não existe um espaço dentro da organização do governo para o nosso instituto funcionar. E não conseguimos ser contratados.
Aqui tem outra
Essa é a razão.
Obrigado, Lelé. Tem uma outra pergunta da Marcela, da FAP, para o Herzog. A Marcela afirma aqui que a arquitetura do Lelé tem um caráter social e funcionalista, e alguns projetos que você apresentou, como a Tate e a Escola de Dança em Londres, também tem um caráter, esse mesmo caráter. Ela pergunta se você acredita que esse tipo de projeto pode interferir na vida da cidade, uma vez que o futuro projeto do Centro de Dança da Nova Luz tem essa mesma ideia. Você acha que eles podem realmente alterar a área degradada aqui em São Paulo, o seu projeto?
I think large urban projects like the Tate or the Leban or the project in Sao Paulo and the Estación de Luz is the main role is to make them public and accessible. And of course, such a big project transforms a neighborhood. You can always debate whether a large cultural project should be implemented or not, or whether there are other strategies to implement just small cells to transform the social mix of a neighborhood. There's not one answer only. The government made the decision now to do this eminently important cultural project, so we should go for that option. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for Sao Paulo. And our role as architects is not only to make a great building, but to make a building which really is for the people, not just for the architect. I don't say that to sound important, but I say this because I honestly believe this is the only way you can do successful architecture, because otherwise history will wipe it off. You cannot cheat in architecture. Architecture is a very honest discipline, because the people give the answer in the street, because they accept the building or they don't accept the building, and they go where they don't go. And the Tate is successful because the turbine hall is a space for nothing, it's just empty, and artists use it for big installations, and at the same time is so important. So it shows that somehow useless. You couldn't plan it. We just, it was an instinct to do this space, and now is the reason why the Tate is successful, because everybody goes there and comes together, meets, even if they don't especially want to see the show of Louis Bourgeois or whatever, but they go there, and unconsciously the spirit of the museum inspires that place. And we want to do the same thing in Sao Paulo with the dance. All these young kids, they should be in a close contact with the neighborhood and vice versa.
Tem uma pergunta da Fernanda AX para o Lelé, perguntando por que você não usa teto verde nos seus projetos, já que isso ajudaria a baixar a temperatura do edifício.
Não, uso sim, em alguns projetos eu já usei teto verde, inclusive numa casa que fiz para mim, que o teto era verde. Mas o que eu acho é que esses projetos, evidentemente que esse arsenal que o arquiteto dispõe de técnicas, né, ele tem que ser aplicado adequadamente para cada caso, né? Então, nesses casos que eu mostrei aqui, até dos hospitais da Rede Sara, a prevalência é dos sheds com o movimento ondulatório para acompanhar o movimento do vento, né? Até porque esses sheds foram muito mais voltados para a questão da ventilação do que para a questão da insolação. Eles têm sempre uma proteção contra o sol, mas, fundamentalmente, eles foram criados para acentuar o movimento do vento. Então, a forma curva e as formas curvas que foram se desenvolvendo em cada caso, elas justificam. Se eu tivesse um terraço verde, nesse caso, eu não poderia ter shed, né? Então, eu acho que os tetos verdes são também formas de se isolar termicamente corretas. Não vejo problema, não.
I think we've had a very long morning, and I just want to say that we talked a bit directly and indirectly about teaching and teachers today, people who have influenced both of your careers. But I think the great thing is that we've had two great teachers with us today. Literally, they both teach architecture, but in terms of their examples as practicing architects. And I think that what they've both shown is that the greatest thing that architecture students can bring is curiosity, energy, and a lot of passion to what they do. So I want to thank you both for having ample supply of all of those qualities. Thank you.
Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer aos nossos dois convidados por essa manhã incrível. Gostaria também de agradecer a todos vocês. E convidamos todos para a última palestra do Arq.Futuro, que vai ser realizada agora à tarde, na Belas Artes, aqui pertinho. Vai começar às 6 horas da tarde. Tá? A palestra vai ser do americano Terence Riley, que ele é conhecido por desenvolver espaços culturais de grande importância, como o Museu de Miami. A entrada lá é franca. Todos aqueles que tiverem interesse em receber o certificado de participação dessa manhã e não preencheram via internet na hora que fizeram o cadastro os seus dados, a gente tem um lugar lá no foyer que vocês podem preencher um formulário que vocês podem preencher os seus dados, tá? E aí depois o certificado a gente envia por e-mail. Bom, o Arq.Futuro não termina aqui, tá? A gente tem a próxima edição já programada para o primeiro semestre do ano que vem, no Rio de Janeiro. Bom, até lá e obrigado a todos mais uma vez.